A brutal winter storm is closing in over a forgotten mountain village in Montana. Snow buries the narrow road, the wind howls through the dark pine forest, and the night grows colder with every passing minute. Through the storm, a weary traveler and his loyal German shepherd K9 arrive at a small wooden house at the edge of the village, hoping only for a place to rest. But the moment the door opens, everything changes. Inside the house, an old man collapses to the floor, his heart failing, his breathing fading fast. The medicine that could save his life is miles away, and the only road to get it runs straight through a locked military zone. Most people would turn back, but sometimes courage arrives in the form of a stranger, and a dog who refuses to quit. What begins as a simple act of kindness will soon become a race against time, a storm, and impossible odds. Because sometimes, the road God places in front of us isn't meant to be easy. It's meant to show us exactly where we belong. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from. And if you enjoy stories about loyalty, courage, and the quiet power of kindness, don't forget to like and subscribe. Now, let's begin the story. The wind came down from the mountains like a living thing. Red Hollow, Montana, was little more than a scattering of aging houses pressed between dark pine forests and the long shadow of abandoned mining hills. In winter, the town often disappeared beneath storms that rolled over the Rockies without warning. On this night, thick snow swirled through the narrow road that led into the valley, swallowing the headlights of passing vehicles before they could reach the first row of houses. Few people traveled through Red Hollow in winter, and tonight, almost no one was out at all, except for one truck slowly pushing through the storm. Inside the old dark green pickup sat Jack Turner, a man who looked like someone the mountains themselves had shaped over time. Jack Turner was 41 years old, tall at about 6 feet, with a broad-shouldered build that had once been hardened by years of military training. His frame was powerful, but lean rather than bulky, the kind of strength built through endurance instead of gym routines. His dark brown hair was cut short in a practical style, streaked faintly with early gray near the temples. A rough stubble lined his jaw, giving him a permanently tired look. But it was his eyes people often remembered first. Steel gray, observant, and quiet. They were the eyes of a man who had spent years in dangerous places, learning to watch everything. Jack had once served as a rescue swimmer for the U.S. military, a job that required diving into freezing water, storms, and disaster zones to pull strangers back from the edge of death. It had taken strength, discipline, and a willingness to run toward danger when others ran away. He had been good at it, maybe too good, but that life was behind him now. These days, Jack drove wherever the road happened to lead. Beside him in the passenger seat sat the only companion who had stayed with him through everything, Ranger. The German shepherd filled the seat like a coiled spring of muscle and alert intelligence. At 5 years old, Ranger was in the prime of his life. His coat was a thick blend of sable black and deep brown, darker along his back and lighter across his chest and legs. Snowflakes clung to the fur around his neck whenever Jack opened the window. Ranger's amber eyes were sharp and thoughtful. Unlike many dogs, he rarely barked without reason. Ranger had once been trained as a canine search and rescue dog, working alongside Jack during military deployments. Over time, the two had developed the quiet understanding that only came from surviving dangerous situations together. Now, even in retirement, Ranger still watched the world like he was on duty. The truck's gas gauge hovered dangerously close to empty. Jack glanced at it and exhaled slowly. "Not much farther, buddy." The dog flicked an ear. Outside, the storm grew worse. Snow drifted across the road in thick waves, and the forest on either side blurred into dark shapes behind the white curtain of wind. The road dipped down into a valley, and through the storm Jack finally saw it. Red Hollow. The town looked tired. Several houses leaned slightly under the weight of snow. Wooden fences sagged. A rusted pickup sat half-buried beside what had once been a general store. Many windows were dark. Jack slowed the truck. Even through the storm he could see something else. Some houses were empty. Boards covered windows. Roofs had partially collapsed under years of winter storms. This place had once been bigger. Now it looked like a town slowly fading from the map. Jack drove slowly down the main road until the truck engine sputtered. The fuel light flashed. "That's it," Jack muttered. He pulled the truck toward the edge of the road near a small wooden house sitting slightly apart from the others. A single porch light glowed warmly through the storm. Ranger lifted his head. The dog stared at the house, ears forward. Jack noticed immediately. Ranger rarely reacted like that without a reason. But after a moment, the dog simply shifted and watched quietly again. Jack grabbed his heavy coat and stepped out of the truck. The cold hit him like a wall. Snow reached halfway up his boots as he walked to the porch. The wooden steps creaked beneath his weight. He knocked on the door. For a moment, nothing happened. Then footsteps approached slowly from inside. The door opened. Standing there was Helen Carter. Helen Carter was 75 years old. A small woman with silver-gray hair pulled into a loose braid that rested over one shoulder. Her face carried deep lines, carved by years of mountain winters and hard work. But there was warmth in her blue eyes. She stood about 5 feet 3 inches tall and wore a thick wool sweater beneath a faded brown coat. Despite her age, there was something steady about her posture, the kind of quiet strength people develop after surviving many difficult years. Helen had spent her entire life in Red Hollow. Once, long ago, the town had been a busy mining community. Her husband had worked in the copper mines along with hundreds of other men. Those days were gone now, but Helen had stayed. Her voice was gentle but cautious. "Yes?" Jack removed his hat politely. "Sorry to bother you, ma'am," he said. "My truck's almost out of gas and the storm's getting worse. I was hoping maybe I could wait out the night somewhere warm." Helen studied him for a moment. Then her eyes moved past him to Ranger standing in the snow. The dog sat quietly, snow gathering on his fur. Helen's expression softened immediately. "Well," she said, opening the door wider, "any man traveling with a dog in weather like this probably isn't looking for trouble." Jack allowed himself a small smile. "Thank you." Ranger stepped inside first. The moment the dog crossed the threshold, something changed. His posture stiffened slightly. He looked around the house carefully. Not aggressive, but alert. The cabin smelled faintly of wood smoke and old pine. A fire burned in a stone fireplace near the far wall. A small kitchen table stood near a window, and a worn armchair sat beside the fire. Sitting in that chair was Walter Carter. Walter Carter was 78 years old, and looked every bit like a man who had spent decades working underground in the mines. His body was large and heavy-shouldered, though age had softened his strength. A thick white beard covered most of his face, and his hands were wide and rough from years of physical labor. His breathing sounded slightly heavy even when sitting still. Walter had once been known as one of the strongest men in the mines, but heart problems had slowed him down in recent years. He looked up when Jack entered. "Storm's a nasty one," Walter said with a gravelly voice. Jack nodded. "Seems that way." Helen closed the door behind them. She gestured toward the fire. "Sit down, warm up." Jack sat near the hearth while Ranger remained standing, scanning the room slowly. The dog's nose twitched. Helen noticed. "Smart dog." "Too smart sometimes," Jack replied. Walter chuckled. Helen moved to the stove and poured 3 cups of coffee. As the wind howled outside, the small house felt surprisingly warm. Jack looked around the room. Old photographs hung on the walls. Some showed miners standing beside heavy machinery. Others showed the town decades earlier, back when Red Hollow had been alive. Helen followed his gaze. "This town used to have 3,000 people," she said quietly. Jack raised an eyebrow. "Really?" Walter nodded slowly. "Copper mine shut down 15 years ago," he said. "Most folks left." Helen placed the coffee mugs on the table, "but some of us stayed." Ranger suddenly stood up. His ears went rigid. Jack noticed immediately. "What is it, boy?" The dog walked slowly toward Walter. For a moment, he simply stared at the old man. Then Walter winced. A small movement at first. His hand pressed against his chest. Helen frowned. "Walter?" The old man tried to speak, but his face tightened in pain. His breathing became sharp and uneven. Jack stood instantly. "Walter?" The old man suddenly collapsed forward in the chair. Helen gasped. "Oh God, Walter." Ranger barked once. Walter clutched his chest, his face turning pale as the pain surged through him. Jack knelt beside him, already recognizing the signs. Heart attack. Helen's voice trembled. "He needs his medicine." Jack looked up sharply. "Where is it?" Helen's face fell. "We ran out this morning. Outside, the storm roared louder against the walls, and somewhere beyond the mountains, the only road out of Red Hollow disappeared into the snow." Walter Carter's body trembled violently in the worn armchair as the pain surged through his chest. His large hands clutched at his shirt as if trying to hold his heart in place. His breathing came in short, ragged bursts that sounded far too thin for a man of his size. Helen Carter stood frozen beside him, her small frame shaking. For a moment she looked like someone who had already seen this nightmare before. "Walter, Walter, stay with me," she whispered, her voice cracking. Jack Turner was already moving. Years of rescue training had drilled certain reactions into him so deeply they had become instinct. He knelt beside Walter and quickly checked the old man's pulse. It was fast, irregular, too fast. Jack glanced up at Helen. "You said he has heart medicine?" Helen pressed a trembling hand against her mouth. "Yes, nitroglycerin tablets," she said. "He takes them when the pain starts." "Where are they?" Helen shook her head slowly. We ran out this morning." The words hung in the air like something fragile breaking. Outside, the storm slammed against the cabin walls again. Ranger let out a low, restless whine. The German shepherd had moved closer to Walter's chair. His amber eyes remained fixed on the old man, his ears forward and tense. Jack stood and looked around the small house. "Is there a pharmacy here in town?" Helen shook her head. "No." Her voice grew quieter. "There used to be, years ago." Jack frowned. "What about the nearest one?" Helen hesitated. "That would be in Grey Ridge," she said. "About 20 miles east." 20 miles. In weather like this, that might as well have been 50. Jack looked toward the window. Snow whipped across the glass so thickly that the outside world looked like a blank white wall. "Is there a doctor in town?" Helen shook her head again. "No doctor since the mine closed." Walter groaned in pain. Jack knelt beside him again. "Walter, can you hear me?" The old man's eyes opened slightly. They were cloudy with pain, but still focused enough to understand. "Heart medicine," Walter muttered. "We're working on it," Jack said calmly. Ranger shifted again. The dog suddenly turned his head toward the back of the cabin. His nose twitched. Then he walked slowly toward a narrow hallway. Jack noticed immediately. "What is it, boy?" Ranger disappeared briefly down the hall. Helen wiped her eyes with the sleeve of her sweater. "I should have gone to Grey Ridge this morning," she murmured. "The weather report said the storm might come, but I didn't think it would be this bad." Jack glanced at her. "Hey," he said quietly. "Right now we focus on what we can do." Helen nodded weakly. Ranger reappeared a moment later. Something clanked softly against the wooden floor as he nudged it forward with his nose. It was an old metal radio. The device was square and heavy, the kind used decades ago by mining crews. Its casing was scratched and faded from years of use. A thick antenna extended from one corner. Jack picked it up. "You still use this?" Helen shook her head. "No. Walter kept it from his mining days." Jack examined the knobs. The radio looked old but sturdy. What did he use it for? Helen managed a faint smile despite the fear in her eyes. "The mine used radio signals underground," she said. "Walter helped maintain them. Said it saved lives during cave-ins." Jack glanced at Walter. "You worked in the mines?" Walter nodded faintly. For a moment his breathing steadied enough for him to speak. 30 years ago. Tunnel collapse." Helen stepped closer. "He pulled 4 men out," she said softly. Her voice held pride mixed with worry. "The roof gave way during a shift change. Most of the workers got out, but a few were trapped." Jack looked back at Walter. The old miner's large hands trembled, but there was still strength in his eyes. "Couldn't leave 'em," Walter rasped. Helen continued. "The rescue crews said the tunnel might collapse again, but Walter went in anyway." Jack understood that kind of decision. He had seen it many times in the military. The quiet moment when someone chose to risk everything for strangers. Jack turned back toward the window. 20 miles. Storm. Unknown road conditions. But Walter didn't have hours. Maybe not even one. Jack made his decision. "I'll go get the medicine." Helen stared at him. "You can't," she said quickly. "The storm." "I've driven through worse." Helen shook her head harder now. "It's not just the storm." Jack frowned. "What do you mean?" Helen hesitated before answering. "The road to Grey Ridge passes through the old military training grounds." Jack raised an eyebrow. "What kind of training grounds?" "Army exercises," she said. "They still use the area sometimes." Jack walked closer. "And?" Helen's expression grew tense. "They started night drills this week. The road gets blocked when they do." Jack absorbed the information. A military training zone meant checkpoints, armed guards, and strict rules. Helen continued. They close the highway whenever the exercises start. No civilian traffic allowed. Jack glanced at the clock above the kitchen doorway. Nearly midnight. Do you know if the road's closed tonight? Helen gave a slow nod. Yes. Walter groaned again. Jack's jaw tightened. He had dealt with military checkpoints before. Most soldiers followed regulations, even when lives depended on bending them. Jack stood up. I'm going anyway. Helen blinked. You'll never get through. Maybe. Jack grabbed his coat. Ranger was already waiting by the door. The dog's tail moved once, slow and steady. Helen stepped forward. You don't even know us. Jack paused. For a moment he didn't answer. Then he looked at Walter, struggling to breathe. I know enough, he said quietly. Helen's eyes glistened. You could die out there. Jack shrugged slightly. Storm doesn't scare me. That wasn't entirely true, but fear had never been a good reason to do nothing. Jack knelt beside Walter once more. Walter, I'm going to get your medicine. The old miner's eyes opened again. Road's bad, he whispered. I've seen worse. Walter studied him carefully. Then he gave a faint nod. Ranger barked once. Jack stood and pulled on his gloves. Helen moved toward a small cabinet near the kitchen sink. She opened a drawer and pulled out a folded piece of paper. This is the name of the medicine, she said, handing it to him. And the pharmacy. Jack glanced at it. Gray Ridge Community Pharmacy. He slipped the paper into his pocket. Helen added quietly, the military gate sits about 10 miles east of here. Jack nodded. Good to know. Ranger scratched lightly at the door. He was ready. Jack opened the door, and the storm rushed in again like a blast of ice. Snow swirled across the porch. Jack turned back once more. Keep Walter sitting upright, he told Helen. If the pain gets worse, loosen his shirt and keep him calm. Helen nodded. Her hands were shaking again. Please, come back. Jack gave a short nod. I will. He stepped outside. The wind nearly pushed him backward. Ranger jumped down from the porch and immediately began scanning the dark road ahead. The truck sat half buried in fresh snow. Jack climbed inside and started the engine. The fuel gauge barely moved. Not much gas left, but enough, maybe. Ranger jumped into the passenger seat. Jack gripped the steering wheel. Through the storm, the road leading east vanished into darkness. Somewhere beyond those mountains sat the only pharmacy that could save Walter Carter's life. And somewhere between here and there stood a military roadblock. Jack shifted the truck into gear. Let's go, partner. The truck rolled slowly forward into the storm. Back inside the cabin, Helen Carter knelt beside her husband's chair. She held Walter's hand tightly. Help is coming, she whispered. Outside, the storm swallowed the sound of the departing engine, and the long road to Gray Ridge waited. The truck crawled forward through the storm like a stubborn animal, refusing to turn back. Snow covered the narrow mountain road in thick drifts that swallowed the tires and forced Jack Turner to drive slowly, both hands tight around the steering wheel. The headlights cut only a short tunnel through the blizzard, revealing flashes of pine trees bent under the weight of ice and wind. Beside him, Ranger sat upright in the passenger seat, his amber eyes alert and constantly scanning the darkness beyond the windshield. The German Shepherd had stopped whining. Now he was working. Jack knew that posture well. Ranger's ears moved slightly with every unfamiliar sound outside the truck, adjusting like small radar dishes in the storm. The wind howled across the mountainside. Jack leaned forward slightly as he drove, peering through the swirling snow. How you doing over there, partner? He muttered. Ranger flicked an ear but didn't look away from the road. They had been driving for almost 15 minutes. The deeper they moved into the valley east of Red Hollow, the steeper the terrain became. The road twisted along the edge of a rocky ridge, with a dark drop hidden somewhere beyond the snow-covered guardrail. Jack had driven dangerous roads before, but storms like this made even familiar terrain unpredictable. For a moment, his mind drifted back years, back to a different storm, different mountains, different life. Jack had once spent long nights flying over frozen seas in military helicopters, strapped into rescue harnesses while waves crashed against sinking ships below. As a rescue swimmer, he had been dropped into storms far worse than this one. The memory came back clearly. Cold water, rotors roaring above him, a man screaming for help in the darkness. Jack shook his head slightly and returned his focus to the road. That life was over, but some instincts never left. He checked the fuel gauge again, still dangerously low. "Just get us there," he muttered to the truck. The road curved sharply around a line of trees. Then something appeared in the headlights. A metal barrier stretched across the road. Jack slowed immediately. Behind the barrier stood a small military checkpoint cabin, illuminated by bright floodlights that cut through the storm like artificial daylight. Two soldiers stood near the gate. Both wore winter combat uniforms and thick tactical jackets. Their rifles were slung across their chests. Ranger stiffened. Jack sighed quietly. Looks like Helen wasn't kidding. The truck rolled to a stop about 20 feet from the gate. One of the soldiers stepped forward. He was a young man, probably in his early 20s, tall and lean, with sharp cheekbones and pale skin reddened by the cold. Snow clung to the shoulders of his uniform. His name tag read, PFC Miller. Private First Class Daniel Miller had only been stationed at the training grounds for 3 months. He had grown up in Kansas and had never experienced mountain winters like this before joining the Army. The cold made him irritable, but the training had made him disciplined. He raised a hand toward the truck. "Stop right there." Jack rolled down the window. Freezing air rushed into the cab immediately. "Evening," Jack said calmly. Miller glanced briefly at Ranger before focusing on Jack again. "Roads closed," the soldier said. "Military training exercise." Jack nodded slightly. "I figured that might be the case." "Then you know you need to turn around." Jack leaned his elbow against the door. "There's a man back in Red Hollow having a heart attack," he said. "Nearest pharmacy's in Gray Ridge. I need to get through." Miller's expression tightened slightly, but his voice remained firm. "I'm sorry, sir. Orders are orders." Jack had expected that answer. "What kind of exercise?" he asked. "Night aviation drills." Right on cue, a distant sound rumbled through the storm, the low mechanical roar of helicopter rotors. Jack looked up instinctively. Moments later, a military helicopter burst through the clouds above the valley, its searchlight slicing across the snow-covered landscape like a blade. The aircraft circled low over the training grounds beyond the checkpoint. Ranger's ears snapped upward. The dog let out a short warning bark. The helicopter passed directly overhead. Snow exploded into the air as the rotor wash tore across the ground. Private Miller squinted against the wind. "You see what I mean?" he said. "Airspace and road both restricted tonight." Jack studied the checkpoint carefully. 2 soldiers, 1 barrier, floodlights, and somewhere beyond it, the road to Gray Ridge. Another soldier stepped out from the checkpoint cabin. This one was older. Sergeant Marcus Delgado, a broad-shouldered man in his late 30s with dark hair cropped close to his head and a thick mustache that made him look older than he actually was. Delgado had spent nearly 15 years in the Army. He had served 2 deployments overseas and had learned to read people quickly. When he approached the truck, his eyes moved from Jack to Ranger. He immediately recognized the posture of a trained working dog. "That a canine?" Delgado asked. Jack nodded. "Search and rescue." Delgado leaned slightly closer. "You military?" "Used to be." "What unit?" Jack hesitated for half a second. "Rescue swimmer." Delgado nodded slowly. That explained the calm. But rules were rules. "You know how this works then," Delgado said quietly. "Training zones locked down." Jack met his eyes. "Man's dying." Delgado's jaw tightened. For a moment, the storm was the only sound between them. Then Delgado shook his head slightly. "I can't authorize civilian traffic through an active exercise zone." Jack leaned back. He had expected that answer too. Ranger suddenly shifted in the seat. The dog's nose pressed briefly against the cracked window. Then he whined. Jack noticed immediately. "What is it?" Ranger's eyes had moved away from the checkpoint. He was staring toward the tree line beside the road. The German shepherd let out a short bark. Jack followed his gaze. Through the snow, barely visible in the headlights, a narrow trail disappeared between the trees. Not a road, more like an old service path. Maybe maintenance access, maybe something older. Jack opened the door and stepped out into the storm. Ranger jumped down beside him. The dog immediately trotted toward the edge of the trees. "Hey," Miller called out. "You can't go over there." Jack raised a hand without turning back. "Just stretching my legs." Ranger lowered his nose to the snow. He sniffed once, then again. The dog moved slowly along the narrow path. Jack crouched beside him. The snow covering the trail looked slightly disturbed beneath the fresh storm layer. Someone, or something, had used it before. Jack glanced back toward the checkpoint. The soldiers were watching carefully, but hadn't moved. Ranger looked up at him. Then he stepped onto the trail and wagged his tail once. Jack smiled faintly. "You think that works?" The dog barked softly. Behind them, the helicopter roared overhead again, circling the training grounds like a mechanical hawk. The floodlights from the checkpoint illuminated the road, but didn't reach the hidden trail. Jack stood slowly. He turned back toward Sergeant Delgado. "Looks like you've got your road secure," Jack said calmly. Delgado folded his arms. "That's the idea." Jack nodded. Then he walked back toward the truck. Ranger followed close behind. The dog glanced once more toward the trail in the trees. Jack climbed into the driver's seat. For a moment he sat silently. Then he started the engine again. Private Miller stepped forward. "You heading back to town?" Jack looked at him. "Yeah," he said. "Guess I have to." The soldier nodded. Jack shifted the truck into reverse. The vehicle rolled backwards slowly along the snow-covered road. The soldiers watched until the headlights faded into the storm. Inside the truck, Ranger turned his head toward the trees again. Jack glanced sideways at the dog. "Good nose," he murmured. The truck continued backing up until the checkpoint lights disappeared from view. Then Jack stopped the truck. He shifted gears again, this time toward the narrow trail Ranger had found. "Let's see where that road goes." The truck rolled slowly off the main highway and disappeared into the dark forest path. The narrow trail Ranger had discovered looked less like a road and more like a memory of one. Jack Turner eased the truck forward slowly, the tires crunching over snow that had not been touched in months. The forest closed around them almost immediately. Tall pine trees stood on both sides of the path like silent guards, their branches bending under thick layers of snow. The headlights barely reached beyond the next bend in the trail, and the storm swallowed the rest of the world. Inside the cab, Ranger leaned forward slightly, nose close to the windshield. The German Shepherd was working again. Jack trusted that instinct more than any map. "All right," Jack muttered quietly. "Lead the way." The truck moved deeper into the forest. The trail sloped upward along the side of a mountain ridge. At times, the tires slipped on hidden ice beneath the snow, forcing Jack to slow even further. Several times he had to stop entirely, while Ranger jumped down from the truck and sniffed the ground ahead, confirming the path was still there. The dog's thick coat was already layered with snowflakes. But Ranger moved confidently through the storm. Jack followed. After nearly 10 minutes, the forest thinned slightly, revealing a steep drop along the right side of the trail. The mountain fell away into a dark valley that the storm had completely swallowed. Only the faint shape of distant trees could be seen below. Jack tightened his grip on the steering wheel. "Yeah, that's not a place we want to slide tonight." The truck crawled along the ridge. Then suddenly, the tires lost traction. The rear of the vehicle fishtailed slightly toward the edge. Jack slammed the brakes, and the truck skidded sideways in the snow. "Easy," he muttered, but the momentum carried the truck dangerously close to the cliff edge. Jack threw the gear into park and stepped out quickly. The wind roared across the ridge. Ranger jumped down beside him. Jack knelt near the front tire. Half the tread was hanging over empty air. "Well, that's not great," he muttered. The snow beneath the wheel had collapsed under the truck's weight. Jack carefully stepped toward the back of the vehicle, trying to redistribute the load. That's when his boots slipped. The snow beneath him suddenly gave way. Jack's foot slid toward the cliff edge, and his body lurched sideways. Before he could react, Ranger lunged forward. The German Shepherd grabbed Jack's coat sleeve with his teeth and pulled backward with surprising strength. Jack dropped to one knee and caught himself before sliding further. For a second, neither man nor dog moved. The wind howled across the ridge. Jack exhaled slowly. "Well," he said quietly, rubbing Ranger's neck, "that's one way to keep me honest." Ranger wagged his tail once, as if the entire situation had been obvious. Jack carefully climbed back into the truck. Using a slow combination of throttle and steering, he managed to ease the vehicle away from the edge and back onto firmer ground. "Good catch," he said. Ranger rested his head briefly against the door. The truck continued along the mountain trail. About 15 minutes later, the forest opened into a wider dirt road. Jack slowed as he approached. Then he saw flashing lights ahead. Red and blue reflections bounced through the storm. A patrol vehicle sat sideways across the road, its emergency lights cutting through the snow. Beside it stood a man bundled in a heavy winter jacket. He turned as the truck approached. Jack pulled to a stop. The man stepped closer. He was tall, around 6'2", with a broad frame that suggested years of physical work. His dark hair was trimmed short, and a trimmed beard lined his jaw. His face carried the weathered calm of someone who had spent long nights dealing with difficult situations. This was Deputy Ryan Holt. Ryan Holt was 38 years old and had served 8 years in the Marine Corps before returning to his hometown of Gray Ridge to work in law enforcement. He had a reputation in the county for being practical, patient, and rarely surprised by anything the mountains threw at him. But seeing a truck appear from an abandoned forest trail during a blizzard was still unusual. Ryan leaned down to the driver's window. "Evening," he said. Jack lowered the window. "Evening." Ryan glanced at Ranger first. The German Shepherd sat calmly in the passenger seat. "Well, that's not something you see every night," Ryan said. "Where'd you come from?" Jack nodded toward the mountain behind him. "Red Hollow." Ryan's eyebrows lifted slightly. "You came through that trail?" "Apparently." Ryan whistled softly. "Most folks don't even know that road exists anymore." Jack nodded once. "Good thing my dog does." Ryan crouched slightly to look closer at Ranger. "Search dog?" "Used to be." Ryan smiled faintly. "Marine Recon had one like him during my deployment." That explained the relaxed posture. Ryan stood again. "What brings you out in this mess?" Jack answered immediately. "Man in Red Hollow having a heart attack. I'm trying to get to the pharmacy in Gray Ridge." Ryan's expression changed. The humor disappeared. "How bad?" "Bad enough." Ryan nodded slowly. "Figures." He glanced toward the mountains behind them. "The military checkpoint still active?" Jack nodded. "Wouldn't let me through." Ryan sighed. "Yeah, they've been running helicopter drills all night." For a moment, Ryan stood silently. Then he walked back to his patrol vehicle and grabbed a radio from the dashboard. He spoke quietly into it for a moment before returning. "All right," he said. "Road to Gray Ridge is still open." Jack leaned forward slightly. "You're letting me pass?" Ryan shook his head. "I'm coming with you." Jack raised an eyebrow. Ryan shrugged. "County policy says I'm supposed to assist in medical emergencies." He pointed toward the back seat. "Besides, if your truck slides off another cliff, I'd rather be there to explain it to the insurance company." Jack chuckled softly. Ryan opened the passenger side back door of the truck and climbed in. Ranger turned briefly to inspect the new passenger before settling again. Ryan scratched the dog's ear. "Good-looking partner you've got." The truck pulled back onto the road. The storm had not eased. Snow continued to fall in thick waves across the highway. After another mile, Ryan suddenly pointed ahead. "Hold up!" Jack slowed. A pickup truck sat sideways in the ditch beside the road. Its hazard lights blinked weakly through the storm. Beside the vehicle stood a small group of people waving their arms. Jack pulled over. A man approached quickly. He was in his early 40s, stocky with a thick winter coat and a wool cap pulled low over his head. Snow clung to his beard. His name was Mark Benson, a mechanic from Gray Ridge who had been trying to drive his family home when the truck lost traction. Behind him stood his wife and their young daughter. The little girl, about 7 years old, wore a bright red jacket that made her easy to spot, even in the storm. Jack stepped out. "What happened?" Mark gestured toward the ditch. "Truck slid on the ice. Can't get traction." Ryan walked over. "Everyone okay?" "Yeah," Mark said. "Just stuck." Jack examined the rear wheels. They were buried deep in snow. "Got a tow rope?" he asked. Mark nodded quickly. "Yeah." 10 minutes later, Jack attached the rope to his truck. He eased the vehicle forward while Mark steered. The truck slowly climbed out of the ditch. When the tires finally reached solid ground again, Mark let out a relieved laugh. "Thank you," he said. Ryan nodded. "Drive slow getting home." The family climbed back into their truck and continued down the road. Jack returned to his seat. Ryan looked at him. "You know we just lost 10 minutes. Jack started the engine. "Worth it," Ryan nodded. "Yeah." The truck accelerated carefully down the highway. Ahead, somewhere beyond the storm, the lights of Gray Ridge waited, and with them, the pharmacy. The storm had not slowed. If anything, it had grown worse. Snow fell in thick sheets that blurred the edges of the road, and the wind pushed against the truck like an invisible wall. Jack Turner leaned forward behind the steering wheel as he drove, his eyes fixed on the faint glow ahead, where the lights of Gray Ridge slowly appeared through the white chaos. Gray Ridge was larger than Red Hollow, but still a small mountain town, the kind built around a single main street with a diner, a gas station, and a few scattered businesses that served the surrounding valley. Tonight, the streets were nearly empty. Most windows were dark, and the few lights that remained glowed dimly through curtains of snow. Jack turned the truck onto Main Street and spotted the sign they needed: Gray Ridge Community Pharmacy. The building stood on the corner beside a small grocery store. Its windows were still lit, casting warm yellow light across the snow-covered sidewalk. Ryan Holt exhaled with relief from the back seat. "Looks like we made it before they closed." Jack pulled the truck to a stop directly in front of the pharmacy. Before the engine had even fully settled, Ranger jumped down from the cab and shook the snow from his thick coat. Jack stepped out next, his boots crunching against the icy pavement. The bell above the pharmacy door jingled as they stepped inside. Warm air immediately replaced the biting cold. Behind the counter stood Dr. Linda Morales, the pharmacist. Linda Morales was a woman in her early 50s, medium height with straight black hair cut into a practical, shoulder-length style. Her glasses rested low on the bridge of her nose as she read a clipboard under the fluorescent lights. She had spent nearly 25 years working as the town's pharmacist and was known for her calm demeanor and sharp memory. Years ago, Linda had been the only medical professional in Gray Ridge during a wildfire evacuation that forced hundreds of residents to leave their homes. During that crisis, she had worked nearly 40 hours straight, distributing medication and supplies to anyone who needed them. Since then, the people of Gray Ridge trusted her completely. She looked up as the door opened. Her eyes immediately noticed Ranger. "Well," she said, pushing her glasses higher, "that's not a typical customer." Jack stepped forward. "Ma'am, we need nitroglycerin tablets. Emergency." Linda's expression changed instantly. "Who for?" "Walter Carter, Red Hollow." Recognition flickered in her eyes. "Walter Carter from the old mine?" Jack nodded. Linda moved quickly to a cabinet behind the counter. "Heart attack?" "Looks like it." She retrieved a small bottle and placed it on the counter. "He should take 1 tablet under the tongue immediately," she said. "Another if the pain continues after 5 minutes." Ryan stepped forward. "We're heading back right now." Linda studied them briefly. "You'll need to hurry," she said quietly. "Storm's getting worse." Jack paid quickly, barely noticing the receipt she handed him. Within seconds, they were back outside. The storm had intensified even during the short time they'd been inside. Snow piled deeper across the road. Ryan climbed into the back seat again. "Let's move." Jack started the engine. The truck turned around and headed back toward the mountain road. For the first 10 miles, the drive went smoothly as any road could in a storm like this. But as they approached the turnoff that led toward Red Hollow, something new appeared in the headlights: a wall of snow. The wind had blown a massive drift across the road, completely blocking it. Jack slowed the truck. "That wasn't there earlier." Ryan leaned forward. "Road plows won't get out here until morning." Jack stepped out to inspect it. The drift reached almost chest-high. No truck was getting through that. Ryan joined him in the snow. "All right," Ryan said. "New plan." He walked back to his patrol vehicle parked behind them and grabbed his radio. "Dispatch, this is Deputy Holt." Static crackled briefly before a voice answered. "Go ahead, Ryan. Medical emergency in Red Hollow. Need ambulance access." There was a pause. Then the dispatcher replied, "Negative. Road conditions are too severe. EMS cannot reach that area tonight." Ryan sighed. "Copy." He turned back toward Jack. "Ambulance can't make it." Jack looked down the road. Red Hollow lay somewhere beyond that drift, miles away. Ranger barked once sharply. The dog had already begun moving along the side of the road, sniffing the snow-covered ditch. Jack watched him. "What do you see?" Ranger trotted forward along the edge of the forest where the snow appeared slightly thinner. Ryan followed the dog's path with his eyes. "There's an old logging trail that cuts toward Red Hollow," he said slowly. Jack looked up. "You sure?" Ryan nodded. "Used it years ago during a search operation." Jack glanced at the snow. "Truck won't make it." Ryan nodded. "Which means we run." Jack didn't hesitate. He grabbed the medicine bottle from his coat pocket. Ranger was already moving. The dog ran several yards ahead, then stopped and looked back to make sure Jack was following. "Stay close," Jack muttered. The three of them moved into the darkness of the forest. Snow reached nearly to their knees. The trail twisted through dense pine trees that blocked much of the wind, but the storm still pushed through the branches in sharp bursts of icy air. Ranger ran ahead repeatedly, sniffing the path before returning. The German Shepherd's training showed in every movement. He checked the ground, circled briefly, then signaled the safest direction forward. Ryan struggled slightly through the deep snow. "Your dog's better at this than we are," Jack allowed a faint smile. "He's had practice." They continued for nearly 20 minutes. Then the trail dropped down toward the valley. Through the trees, Jack could finally see the faint outline of Red Hollow's scattered houses. "Almost there," Ryan said. Jack pushed harder. But inside the small wooden house at the edge of town, time was running out. Helen Carter knelt beside Walter's chair, holding his hand tightly. The old miner's breathing had grown shallow. His skin looked pale beneath his beard. Helen's eyes were red from crying. "Please stay with me," she whispered. The room felt unbearably quiet except for the wind outside. Helen's mind drifted back to another night long ago. 30 years earlier, the mine collapse. She remembered standing outside the tunnel entrance with dozens of other families waiting for news. The rescue teams had warned that the shaft might collapse again at any moment. But Walter had gone inside anyway. He had tied a rope around his waist and crawled into the unstable tunnel where 4 men were trapped. For nearly 2 hours, no one had heard anything. Then the rope had moved. Walter emerged covered in dust and blood, dragging the first injured miner behind him. 3 more trips followed. By the time he finished, Walter could barely stand. But all 4 men had survived. Helen squeezed his hand now. "You didn't give up on them," she whispered. "So don't give up now." Outside, footsteps crunched in the snow. Ranger reached the porch first. The dog barked loudly. Jack ran up the steps behind him, breath fogging in the cold air. Ryan followed close behind. Jack pushed the door open. "Helen!" She turned instantly. Hope flashed across her face. Jack stepped forward and held up the bottle. "We got it." The front door of the Carter house slammed shut behind Jack Turner as the storm raged outside. Snow clung to his coat and boots, melting slowly onto the wooden floor as he stepped quickly toward the chair where Walter Carter sat slumped and barely conscious. Helen Carter stood beside her husband, her thin hands gripping the arms of the chair as if trying to hold him upright through sheer will. For a moment, no one spoke. The only sounds in the room were the wind battering the walls and Walter's weak breathing. Jack moved immediately. "Walter, can you hear me?" he said, kneeling beside the old miner. Walter's eyelids flickered. His chest rose shallowly, each breath sounding like it cost him effort. Helen looked at the small bottle in Jack's hand, as if it were the most precious thing in the world. "You found it," she whispered. Jack nodded once. Ryan Holt stepped inside behind him, brushing snow from his shoulders. The tall deputy stood quietly near the door, giving Jack room to work. Ranger padded into the room and immediately positioned himself beside Walter's chair. The German Shepherd watched closely, his amber eyes fixed on the old man. Jack opened the bottle and shook a small tablet into his hand. "Helen," he said calmly, "help me lift his chin." Her hands trembled, but she did exactly as he asked. Jack placed the small white tablet beneath Walter's tongue. "Let it dissolve," he said. For several seconds, nothing seemed to happen. Walter's breathing remained shallow. Helen's eyes filled with tears again. Ryan checked his watch. "Give it a minute," he said quietly. The room felt painfully still. Outside, the storm continued howling through Red Hollow. Then slowly, very slowly, Walter's breathing changed. The tight strain in his chest eased slightly. His shoulders lowered. The next breath came deeper. Jack felt Walter's wrist again. The pulse was still weak, but steadier. Helen noticed the difference immediately. "Walter?" she whispered. Walter opened his eyes a little wider this time. He looked confused at first. Then he focused on Helen. "You're crying," he murmured faintly. Helen laughed through her tears. "Of course I am." Walter blinked slowly. "What happened?" Jack leaned back slightly, relief finally creeping into his voice. "You decided to scare everyone." Walter tried to smile. Ranger wagged his tail once. Ryan exhaled from across the room. "Well," he said, "that's the best news I've heard all night." Jack handed Helen the bottle. "If the pain comes back, give him another tablet in 5 minutes." She nodded quickly. "I will." Walter looked toward Jack. For a long moment the old miner studied him. Then he spoke quietly. "You drove through that storm? For me?" Jack shrugged slightly. Seemed like the right thing to do. Walter nodded slowly. Then exhaustion overtook him and his eyes closed again. but this time he was breathing steadily. Helen covered him with a blanket and sat beside him, still holding his hand. Ryan stepped outside briefly to radio dispatch. When he returned a few minutes later, the tension in his face had softened. "Ambulance will try to get here in the morning," he said. Jack nodded. "That'll work." Ranger stretched out on the rug near Walter's chair, finally relaxing after the long night. The storm continued for several hours before slowly weakening near dawn. By morning, the story had already begun spreading through the small valley. Red Hollow was not a large town. There were barely 100 residents left after the mines closed years earlier. News traveled quickly. By midday, neighbors had begun stopping by the Carter house. One of the first was Martha Collins, a woman in her early 60s who lived 2 houses down the road. Martha was tall and thin, with curly gray hair that refused to stay tied back, and she had a habit of speaking loudly, even in quiet rooms. She had spent most of her life working as a school teacher before retiring when the town population shrank. When she stepped into the Carter house and saw Walter sitting up with a blanket over his shoulders, she shook her head in disbelief. "I heard half the story already," she said, "but I had to see it myself." Helen smiled. "Walter's doing better." Martha looked toward Jack. "And this is the man who drove through a blizzard to save him." Jack shifted slightly, clearly uncomfortable with the attention. Ranger, however, seemed pleased with the new visitors and wagged his tail politely. "Don't forget the dog," Ryan added. Within 2 days, nearly everyone in Red Hollow had heard about the stranger and his canine, who had brought medicine through the storm. The town had not seen much excitement in years. For Jack, life returned to quiet routines quickly. He helped repair the Carter's porch railing that had loosened during the storm. He cleared snow from the road near several houses. Ranger spent most afternoons exploring the snowy hills around town. 2 weeks later, Walter Carter was strong enough to walk outside again. The old miner moved slowly, but with determination, leaning on a wooden cane Helen insisted he use. Jack was standing beside his truck one afternoon, tightening a strap on the roof rack. He had been preparing to leave. Ryan Holt walked up the driveway. "You heading out?" Jack nodded. "That was always the plan." Ryan studied him carefully. "You know this town doesn't get many people like you." Jack gave a small smile. "Not sure that's a compliment." Ryan leaned against the truck. "You ever think about staying?" Jack shrugged. "I don't stay anywhere long." Before Ryan could respond, Walter Carter stepped out onto the porch. The old man walked slowly but steadily toward them. Helen followed a few steps behind. Walter stopped beside Jack. For a moment, he said nothing. Then he looked out across the valley where Red Hollow's scattered houses sat quietly among the snowy hills. "This town used to have thousands of people," Walter said. Jack nodded. "Mine closed." Walter tapped his cane lightly against the ground. "That's right." He turned toward Jack. "But what's left here is still worth something." Jack didn't respond. Walter continued. "You know what keeps a place alive?" Jack raised an eyebrow. Walter smiled slightly. "People who show up when others need help." Ryan crossed his arms. "He's got a point." Walter looked directly at Jack. "This village could use someone like you." Jack glanced toward the street. Several children were playing in the snow near the old general store. Ranger ran among them happily, chasing a snowball one of the kids had thrown. The German Shepherd looked younger than he had in months. Ryan spoke again. "I've been trying to organize a volunteer rescue team for the valley," he said. "Search and rescue, winter emergencies, things like that." Jack looked back at him. Ryan shrugged. "We could use someone who actually knows what they're doing." Jack watched Ranger for a long moment. The dog rolled in the snow while the children laughed. Walter rested a hand on Jack's shoulder. "You saved my life," the old miner said quietly. "But more than that, you reminded this town that people still look out for each other." Jack exhaled slowly. Then he smiled. "Guess I could stay a while." Ryan grinned. "That's good enough for me." Helen wiped a tear from her eye. Ranger barked happily and ran back toward Jack. 1 year later, Red Hollow looked different. The town was still small, but it no longer felt forgotten. Jack Turner had helped organize a mountain rescue team made up of volunteers from Red Hollow and nearby Gray Ridge. They trained together every month. Ranger became the team's official search dog. Children in town often followed him around like he was a local celebrity. Walter Carter recovered steadily and could often be found sitting outside the general store, telling visitors the story of the night a stranger and his dog drove through a blizzard to save his life. Helen Carter reopened the old community kitchen that had once fed miners decades earlier. Now it served meals to elderly residents and travelers passing through the valley. And every winter evening, when the winds swept down from the mountains again, the lights of Red Hollow still glowed warmly in the snow. Because sometimes a town doesn't need thousands of people to survive. Sometimes it only needs a few who choose to stay. Sometimes the biggest turning points in life do not arrive with loud signs or dramatic moments. They come quietly, in the middle of an ordinary night, when someone chooses to help another person, simply because it is the right thing to do. Jack thought he was just passing through a forgotten village during a snowstorm. He believed he was only doing a small act of kindness by helping a stranger in need. But in the end, that one decision changed not only one life, but an entire community. A man was saved, a town found hope again, and a traveler who once felt lost discovered a place where he truly belonged. This story reminds us of something simple but powerful. Every day, we pass people who may be fighting battles we cannot see. A neighbor who needs help, a stranger who needs kindness, a friend who just needs someone to show up. We may think our actions are small, but to someone else, they may mean everything. Sometimes God places us exactly where we are needed, even when we do not realize it at the time. So, the next time you have the chance to help someone, listen to that quiet voice in your heart. A small act of compassion might be the very thing that changes a life. And sometimes, the life that changes the most is our own. If this story touched your heart today, take a moment to share your thoughts in the comments. Tell us where you were watching from and what part of the story meant the most to you. Your words might encourage someone else who needs hope right now. And if you believe that kindness, courage, and faith still matter in this world, please like the video and subscribe to the channel so you do not miss more stories like this. May God watch over you and your family. May He guide your steps, protect your home, and fill your life with peace, even in the middle of life's storms. If you believe that God places the right people in our path at the right time, write Amen in the comments.